Okay, so you're a Pākehā politician in the late 1800s. You've just tipped the balance of power away from tangata whenua into your hands. What do you do next?
What kind of society do you live in? How do you pay for the roads and railways? What happens if there's a global economic crash?
And of course, do you let anyone other than rich white guys make these decisions?
Kia ora koutou, I'm Lee Madam McLaughlin.
And I'm William Ray.
And this is the Aotearoa History Show. It's not easy setting up a new nation, and early on in our colonial history, there was a big fight among Pākehā over how New Zealand should be governed.
There were two sides, the provincialists and the centralists.
The provincialists thought each province should run itself, and the centralists thought there should be one big central government.
One of the leading centralists was a guy called Julius Vogel. Funnily enough, Vogel started his career as a hardcore provincialist in Otago. He'd even argued the North and South Islands should become different countries. Some South Islanders still want that to happen. One of the things which convinced Vogel to become a centralist was money. The New Zealand Wars had left the government badly in debt, and banks would only lend money to a strong central government.
In 1869, Vogel's centralist smashed the provincialists. He was made treasurer and promised to borrow £6 million over 10 years. Vogel used that money to launch what they called the Grand Goahead policy, building roads, bridges, railways and telegraph lines.
Government spending bolstered a flagging economy. Local factories started building things like railway wagons on government contracts. Unemployment fell, average wages rose. It also helped that wool prices were skyrocketing. With the end of the American Civil War, Kiwi-grown wool was no longer undercut by cheap slave-made cotton.
The centralists had won the argument. Their new railways and telegraph lines broke down some of the barriers of distance and made central government more workable. In 1876, the provincial governments were officially abolished.
By this point, the government owed more than £18 million. But Vogel wasn't worried. The economy was booming. They'd be able to pay back that money soon.
All this spending was about to come back to bite us. It was the beginning of the Long Depression.
The Long Depression is called long because it lasted more than 10 years. In 1878, there was an international credit crisis. It was a little bit like the 2008 global financial crisis. Banks stopped lending money, demand for goods and services dropped. Before the crash, the New Zealand government had directly employed a lot of people through public work programs. But now there was no money to fund those programs, so the work dried up.
Families got desperate. Women and children worked long hours in sweatshops for tiny wages. People sold their wedding rings and tools. Some mothers sewed clothes from flour bags for their kids, and some kids even slept in the streets under old sacks. Some settlers sent petitions to Australia and the United States begging for help to leave.
One of the petitions said, "We, the undersigned, being in every sense of the word genuine working men, having been miserably betrayed by false representations of New Zealand immigration agents, lecturers and printed pamphlets, are now facing the bitter reality of parading the streets, hungry and ill-shod, with no prospect of a better future."
The settlers were in shock. They'd come to New Zealand to escape grinding poverty in the UK. Now it had followed them here. Vogel got a lot of blame for this, and people were writing to the newspaper saying he should be strung up by the heels for his lies.
Okay, so here's a question. Was it good or bad that the Vogel administration spent so much money on infrastructure? I mean, on one hand, that spending lifted New Zealand out of an economic slump. But on the other hand, it contributed to a much worse economic slump a few years later. On the other hand, we still use a lot of that infrastructure today. It's contributed billions upon billions of dollars to the New Zealand economy. But on the other hand, it helped accelerate the destructions of New Zealand's natural environment. But on the other hand...
William! No, stop.
Okay.
The good news at this point in the story is that a historical hero is on the horizon. A saviour of the New Zealand economy. A champion which beeps at you annoyingly when you leave its door open. The fridge.
People had experimented transporting meat and dairy overseas using refrigerated ships for a long time, but they were either too expensive or too unreliable. That is, until a mega landowner called William Davidson gave it a try.
Davidson looked at these failed experiments, made some improvements, and eventually converted a whole ship into a giant sailing refrigerator.
That's right. We invented a floating fridge, a freezing frigate, an icy ark.
On the 15th of February 1882, the Dunedin Sit sailed from Port Chalmers with a cargo of nearly 5,000 sheep carcasses, 250 kegs of butter, hare, pheasant, turkey, chicken, and 2,226 sheep tongues.
Sheep tongues. It worked perfectly. The first voyage turned a profit of £4,700.
The meat export business revolutionised New Zealand's economy. Sheep farmers had a totally new income stream. It used to be that farmers with too many sheep would literally drive them off a cliff and into the sea.
Now they could sell sheep to the meatworks for money, and those meatworks created thousands of new jobs for unemployed workers.
Dairy farms started to become more common too, which opened up another new stream of exports and jobs.
Refrigeration single-handedly saved our economy. It's still really important today. We export about 100,000 tonnes of chilled meat every year, plus another 800,000 tonnes of butter and cheese.
Okay, so economically we've gone from boom to bust and back to boom. And that's going to be a bit of a theme in New Zealand's economy. On the political front, there was also a whole lot of instability.
New Zealand's first election was in 1853, and from the start, voting rights were based on two things. One, you have to be a man, because, patriarchy. Two, you have to be a householder. That first rule's pretty straightforward, but the second one gets a bit tricky. A householder was someone who either owned or rented a place to live, and that property had to be worth something. It couldn't just be a random tent on a beach. The justification was that this rule ensured voters had a stake in the future of New Zealand. If people owned or rented a home, it suggested they were putting down roots. They weren't just travelling workers or sailors.
This rule also prevented virtually all Maori men from voting. That's because Maori didn't own their land privately. They owned it communally as part of their iwi or hapu. This was at least partially deliberate. Maori outnumbered Europeans in lots of voting districts, and the colonial government didn't want to give those Maori too much political power, particularly given they were still trying to strong-arm Maori into handing over their land. We'll be talking more about that in the next episode.
The first change to New Zealand's voting system came when gold was discovered in New Zealand in the late 1850s. Gold miners weren't householders, so they couldn't vote, but they still had to pay quite a lot of taxes. Over in Australia, miners had rioted over this injustice, and the New Zealand government was worried the same thing might happen here. So in 1860, they granted voting rights to any man with a prospecting or business licence. But that created a new problem. Most of the gold mining was happening in the South Island, which meant the South now had a lot more votes and a lot more political power.
People in the North Island weren't happy about that, so in 1867, Parliament set up 4 special Maori electorates, 3 in the North and 1 in the South. They granted all Maori men the right to vote for MPs in those electorates. The new Maori seats dealt with that North-South power imbalance.
Plus, there was one more reason to give Māori voting rights. Back in Britain, the authorities were a bit unhappy with the colonial government's confiscation of Māori land and its plans to obtain more land through legislation. Giving Māori seats in Parliament was kind of political cover. Because, look, we can't be oppressing the natives, we've given them seats in Parliament.
But that only went so far. Based on the population numbers, there should have been 15 Māori MPs. Limiting Māori to 4 seats was a deliberate move to restrict their power.
So, in 1889, the property restrictions were completely abolished. Pretty much all men could vote, Māori and Pākehā, the rich and the poor.
But in the minds of a lot of Kiwis, this created another kind of problem. A lot of the men who could now vote were very heavy drinkers.
Alcohol was a big problem in colonial New Zealand. Nearly half of all convictions between 1855 and 1870 were for drunkenness. Heavy drinking seems to go hand in hand with a frontier society. You see very similar concerns in Australia and the United States around the same time.
Lots of women and a fairly big chunk of men wanted alcohol completely banned, and this political alliance helped New Zealand become the first country in the world where women could vote. One of the leaders of the alcohol prohibition movement was Kate Shepherd, the New Zealand head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance is just an old-timey word meaning no drinking.
Kate Shepherd argued that if women got the vote, they could help elect prohibitionist MPs, who could then pass laws restricting the sale of alcohol. And alcohol was just part of it. Shepherd and her fellow suffragists argued that women could be a voice for morality in Parliament, cleansing the corruption which many believed had infected New Zealand politics.
Meanwhile, Maori women like Mere Te Tai Mangakahia had lobbied for women to vote and stand in Te Kotahitanga, a national pan-tribal Maori parliament which had sprung up in the wake of the New Zealand Wars. People like Mere Te Tai Mangakahia argued that wahine Māori should also have voting rights in the New Zealand parliament, given they owned land just like Māori men. She and other wahine joined forces with the Pākehā suffragists.
But the anti-suffragists argued giving women the vote was dangerous. Like, here's a typical anti-suffrage cartoon. We've got a man in a dress, he's looking all sad, dinner's burning, the cat's got into the milk jug, the kids are fighting, the whole fabric of society's falling to pieces. The anti-suffragists argued women didn't even want the vote. It was just a radical fringe who was stirring up trouble.
But that was an argument Kate Shepherd knew how to win. She and her fellow activists gathered signatures from women all around the country demanding the vote. In 1891, the first petition had 9,000 signatures. That more than doubled the next year. And finally, in 1893, they collected 32,000 signatures. Almost a quarter of the adult Pākehā women living in New Zealand signed it.
The male politicians were forced to listen.
On September the 19th, 1893, New Zealand became the first self-governing country in the world where women could vote. It's one of the greatest moments of our history, a moment where we genuinely led the world.
But we still had a big chunk of the population who were blocked from voting. Chinese New Zealanders. The gold rush has brought a lot of Chinese miners to New Zealand, and the colonial government was not at all happy about that. All through the late 1800s, politicians passed racist laws aimed at stopping more Chinese people from coming to New Zealand. There were poll taxes and reading tests and rules blocking people of Chinese descent from getting pensions. And just keep in mind, these laws didn't just affect Chinese migrants. They often affected Chinese New Zealanders whose families had lived in this country for multiple generations. Rules which blocked people of Chinese descent being naturalised as New Zealand citizens stayed in force until the 1950s. It was only then that most Chinese Kiwis got the right to vote.
Opening up voting to more people in the late 1800s went hand in hand with the rise of New Zealand's first organised political party, the Liberal Party.
The Liberal Party formed under the leadership of a guy called Richard Seddon, or, as he was better known, King Dick. Not a joke, that was his actual real nickname.
Put it away. Seddon was a hardcore populist, and the Liberals were heavily supported by unionised workers. Unions had seen a big boost during the Long Depression as they fought for better working conditions and pay. The support of unions helped the Liberal Party win elections all the way from 1891 to 1912, 21 years. They were the longest serving government in New Zealand history. The Liberals passed laws for shorter working hours and old age pensions. They cracked down on child labour, reformed tax laws and expanded local industry. But also some of them were hardcore racists. It was the Liberals who passed a lot of those nasty anti-Chinese laws.
The Liberals' goal was to support workers but discourage class conflict. They were particularly keen to avoid huge strikes which were crippling entire industries in the UK and USA, leading to violent government crackdowns. So in 1894, the Liberals created compulsory arbitration courts to handle disputes between employers and workers.
But in the early 1900s, those courts refused to raise wages to match inflation. Workers' pays stopped keeping pace with the rising costs of food and housing. This made those workers pretty angry. So they started to join a more aggressive organisation, the New Zealand Federation of Labour, the Red Feds.
The Red Feds refused to accept the rulings of the arbitration courts. Instead, they got their members to strike illegally, hoping to force employers to meet their demands. A lot of Red Fed leaders were full-on revolutionaries. They wanted the labour unions to seize power from the capitalist oppressors and finally give true freedom to the working man.
But for most New Zealand voters, the revolutionary rhetoric of the Red Feds was a step too far. By 1912, some voters had abandoned the Liberals and the Reform Party came to power. Reform was a conservative anti-union party which had crystallised around a farmer turned politician called William Massey. Massey's administration cracked down on the Red Feds and the Red Feds responded by launching the biggest strike New Zealand had ever seen, the Great Strike of 1913.
15,000 men walked off the job. The ports of New Zealand's largest cities shut down, trade ground to a halt, mines closed all over the country. Violent fights broke out between special constables and angry strikers.
But the Red Feds didn't have the money or the political support to keep the strike going. And by the end of 1913, it petered out.
This was a massive defeat for the labour movement, but it taught them an important lesson. Most New Zealanders were put off by the hardcore tactics and rhetoric of the Red Feds. They thought workers should win rights through elections and negotiation, not through violence or revolution.
The leaders of the early labour movement took this lesson on board. From now on, they'd focus on winning power through politics. 3 years after the Great Strike of 1913, those leaders formed the New Zealand Labour Party and began a new era of New Zealand politics.
So, while all this wrangling was going on around voting and economics and politics, there was another huge shift taking place.
Aotearoa was being transformed. Huge numbers of Europeans were migrating to the new colony of New Zealand. And there was one thing all those colonists desperately wanted: land.
Next episode, we'll be talking about those colonists and how they got hold of that land.
Thanks for joining us on the Aotearoa History Show, produced by RNZ and made possible by the RNZ New Zealand On Air Digital Innovation Fund.